People around the world only know about Bosnia for one of two reasons. The first reason is whatever this is supposed to be.
Crazy hamburger! Crazy hamburger! This is horrible!
And the second, but arguably more important reason, is all of the geopolitical conflicts that have taken place because of this nation. This random-ass country in the middle of the Balkans most people have never even heard of, single-handedly started World War I and II, is the main reason the Balkans are so dysfunctional. It was the epicenter of the last genocide that has taken place within European soil, and is arguably the most dysfunctional place on the entire continent. The situation is so bad that despite being a single nation on paper, half the country hates the other half with a burning passion simply because they speak using a slightly different accent. However, despite all the challenges, the nation in recent years has achieved some marginal progress. Many industries like manufacturing, banking, and especially tourism seem to be growing at quite a rapid pace. Foreign companies have begun investing massive amounts of money into the nation, and the country is slowly healing from its very dark and depressing history. So in this video, let's explore Bosnia, from being fragmented by the Roman Empire to becoming Ottoman territory and later down the line joining Yugoslavia. Let's also take a look at their modern economy and what the future is likely to look for them. Spoiler alert, it's not what you think. The story of Bosnia begins around the 3rd century BC with the Illyrians. These guys are a tribal group of very fierce and capable warriors that were rapidly increasing their influence and power. However, as they kept expanding their territory, at some point they ended up meeting the Romans. The following conflict between the two sides was very dragged out and extremely brutal. The Illyrians would simply never quit, and Bosnia became somewhat of a Vietnam War for the Romans. They spent massive amounts of money and manpower trying to keep everything under control. Eventually, they did manage to conquer them. However, by 476, Rome itself was collapsing, and the mighty empire broke into two different sides. On the west was the Roman side that followed the Catholic faith, and on the east was the Greek side that followed the Orthodox faith. By pure chance, once the two sides split, the border between them happened to be Bosnia, which is actually the root cause behind all the modern-day issues the nation is experiencing. Even today, the West, with the Croats, is predominantly Catholic, while the Serbs in the East are Orthodox Christians. From the breakup all the way until 1200, Bosnia became the punching bag of Europe. Almost every single nation that could invade them did invade them. It started with the Goths and the Huns, then the Byzantines reclaimed the territory. The first waves of Slavic migration into Bosnia began around this time. And lastly, the Bulgarians, the Croats, and the Serbians all tried to exert as much influence on the nation as they could. However, despite Bosnia being the laughingstock of Europe for the last 2,000 or so years, what many people don't know is that Bosnia used to be a major power within the continent during their golden age. From around 1200 to 1450, Bosnia was its own kingdom. This period also laid the groundwork for the modern religious identity of Bosnia. While the Bosnians were Christians back then, they didn't belong to either the Orthodox or Catholic churches. Instead, they created their own Bosnian church. However, the other two denominations saw them as heretics and not as proper Christians, which made the Bosnians feel isolated from the rest of the Christian world. And because of that, once the Ottomans took over the Balkans, it made it really easy for them to switch their religion to Islam. However, after 400 years of Ottoman rule, the empire was rapidly collapsing and losing power. The Austrians, seeing this golden opportunity in front of their eyes, decided to occupy Bosnia in 1878 and fully annexed it in 1908. As most of you know, this decision made the Serbians and Russians very angry, which eventually led to the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and the beginning of the First World War. Now it's officially time to talk about the most interesting period of Bosnian history. Yugoslavia is undeniably one of the most interesting national experiments to ever happen in history. With both the Ottoman and Austrian empires suddenly collapsing, the South Slavs suddenly gained independence and the ability to govern themselves for the first time in a really long time. But this freedom could be taken away from them very quickly. Many other big nations, most notably the Italians, were looking at the Balkans as a possible place for territorial expansion. So suddenly, all of the ethnic groups in this region realized that they had no choice but to work together in a desperate attempt to save themselves. There only existed one tiny little problem with this whole idea. All of them hated each other with a burning passion. The main problem behind everything was quite simple. Inside of Yugoslavia existed three main groups. The first one were the Serbians and the Montenegrins. They wanted a centralized state that was primarily controlled by them, mainly because they accounted for roughly 40% of the entire population population. On the other hand, the Croats and Slovenians, which accounted for roughly 35% of the population, hated this idea and wanted the Serbians to keep as little power inside the nation as possible. All of the other ethnic groups like the Albanians, the Skopjeans, the Hungarians, the Bosniak Muslims, and the other minorities were stuck in the middle, having little to no representation inside of the government. Their relationship with the Soviets and the West was also very unique. During World War II, Yugoslavia was one of the few examples of nations that liberated themselves. This unique position gave them a lot of leverage over the Soviets, and unlike other Eastern European nations that had no choice but to listen to Stalin, Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia, kept some distance from them. During the Cold War, at least from the outside, it appeared that Yugoslavia was unaligned and kept great relationships with both sides. In reality, what was actually happening behind closed doors was that the Yugoslavians were constantly going broke. The West, which was desperate to keep them as far away from the Soviets, constantly kept sending them free money and very generous loans to keep the Yugoslavian economy working properly. However, this was never destined to last. Nationalism and ethnic conflicts never really went away, and once the Soviets were out of the picture, the West saw no benefit in sending the Yugoslavians copious amounts of money. So in 1992, the nation fell into civil war. The Bosnian War was undeniably the most violent, senseless, and bloody conflict on European soil since the ending of the Second World War, and the reason behind it can be summed up in one singular picture. Bosnia as a nation is extremely diverse. It's predominantly populated by three groups: the Bosniak Muslims, the Bosnian Serbs, and the Bosnian Croats. I won't get too political or dive too deep into the conflict, mainly because I want to avoid 12-year-old Serbian keyboard warriors mass reporting my channel. However, here is a super simplified explanation of the war. Everyone wanted Bosnia to split up into three distinct parts. The Serbs would join Serbia, the Croats would join Croatia, and the Muslims would form an independent nation. However, that proved to be much harder to achieve in practice, mainly because it was virtually impossible to draw new borders without splitting up families or forcing people out of their homes. The other option was to declare Bosnia as an independent nation and force the three communities to coexist with each other. Everyone hated this idea, but the Serbians hated it the most. Under Yugoslavia, the Serbians were by far the largest ethnic group, which gave them an immense amount of power on the political stage. However, all of a sudden, the Serbians in Bosnia realized that they were a minority in this new nation. So once the outside world started recognizing Bosnia as an independent nation, the Serbian Bosnians started killing civilians. Over the next 3 years, a total of 100,000 people, with roughly 40% of them being innocent civilians, would end up losing their lives. The most heinous event of this war has to be the Srebrenica genocide. Up until that point, the UN and NATO had taken very minimal action against the Serbs. Their actions were mostly centered around protecting civilians and moving supplies. However, everything was about to change. The town of Srebrenica was declared a UN safe zone. It hosted roughly 40,000 refugees and was protected by a few hundred Dutch soldiers. While the city had very little military or strategic value, the Serbian leader simply didn't give a fuck. He ordered his soldiers to attack the city, with their sole objective being to kill as many people as they could. They captured the refugees, they kidnapped the women and kids, and they proceeded to execute every single male over the age of 12. By the end of it, 8,000 innocent, defenseless civilians were dead. The senseless massacre finally caused NATO to do something about the situation. They gave military support to the Muslims and the Croats, who were working together at that time, and they finally managed to push back the Serbians. The leader, fearing for his life, had no choice but to follow their requests, and in 1995, a peace agreement was signed. However, the peace treaty was extremely confusing and complicated, and because of that, Bosnia has one of the most weird political systems on the planet. They have 3 presidents that rule the nation together. Each of them, as you can imagine, has very different opinions and views on how Bosnia should run as a country. However, because each of them also has veto power, simple things like passing a budget or passing new legislation is almost impossible. On the economic side, things aren't that much better. GDP per capita is one of the lowest in Europe. Starting a company or scaling up a startup is virtually impossible inside the nation. The quality of the infrastructure is horrendous, and corruption is still a massive challenge. However, I do have to acknowledge that minor progress has been achieved, and this might be a sign of things to come. As I mentioned before, some industries, and especially tourism, have been doing a lot better as of recently, and if the nation keeps up this momentum, we might see Bosnia start to prosper in the near future. Click here to watch another video, and have a great rest of your day, guys.